Day one roundtable discussion. Day one ended with an open discussion on future technologies, including both those discussed earlier and other technological advances we can expect over the next decades. Speaker bios are at futureofinterface.org/bios.
We're now into an opportunity for a serious roundtable discussion about what we've heard today. And the questions that we're going to try to answer, I think among the questions we'll try to answer are, what have we learned from today's discussion about potential and possibilities for the next 20 years? What is it that we can't do that we would like to do? And what's preventing us from doing that? Do we have any solutions to break through those barriers? And what did we miss in today's conversation about projecting 2 decades into the future? Gregg, you probably might want to add to that brief summary what your aspirations are for this next hour of discussion.
No, first of all, I want to mention that all panelists that are here, I see a number of them all on here. You're free to turn on your cameras and your microphones because this is open to all of you, and so we'd like you to all join in. And the topics, if you're interested, etc. Hi, Kathy. Look at sensors, localizability. Questions like we heard a lot about AI today, and I know that everybody, as soon as you talk about AI and the fact that it would be a lot better if it was personalized, and that's scary, like all my information, personal information, is going to get fed into this big AI pool. Who all has access to it? So, one of the questions is, and I don't know the answer, would be, how long would it be before something like this can be localizable, where you can have all this great AI, except that I could pull the model down and run it on my phone, and my information I can feed to it, that contextualization we're talking about, but it would not go back up to the cloud. And this could also, if I can personalize it, I think that came up earlier, Vint, if you can personalize it, it can then shape it and help it to overcome some of this bias. Like, I don't want the AI to always assume I'm the average person, and I'm not sure what the average person is, but I don't think anybody, there's a small number of people who are going to fall into being the average person on every dimension. And so maybe that's a thing. So I'd like to start off talking about that, but also a number of the other topics. And I know that Andreas has harvested a bunch of ideas also to bring forward. So can we just first, I'd like to get people's thoughts about the importance of personalization and localization of personalization.
Can I give one example of that?
Yeah.
Google has an application that runs on the Pixel mobiles, called Live Transcribe. It will take up to 100 different languages, and it will produce a transcription of the selected language, assuming that's what's being spoken. The limitations are that it has to get a pretty good quality audio signal in order to do the transcription. Historically, we've pushed the digitized sound to the cloud, processed that, and then sent it back to the mobile and then displayed the transcription. But we believe we're on the course to get all of this to happen locally in the mobile, in response to Gregg's concerns about personalization and private information never leaving the device. And so I see that as a feasible example of localization. Although getting high-powered artificial intelligence into something in your hand feels like it's a stretch, but then we would have said the mobile, a smartphone, so to speak, was a stretch if we were talking about it in 1965. I see, is it Rain or Rhine? Has her hand up.
It is Rain, like the weather.
Rain, as in, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Go for it.
To your point, Vint, we already have AI that does have local models that are out on products that are in use today. So live transcribe being one example, but also anyone who makes use of natural language voices in text to speech is using some kind of an AI model to engage with that natural language voice. And some of those are served locally, some are served online. So I don't know that it's actually too far out there that some of the more practical or pragmatic versions of these tools at smaller scale than the kind of lofty description that we say when we just sort of think generally about AI. I don't think they're really that far out or that impossible. And then the other thing that I want to mention is that it's not necessarily, and I apologize if you're hearing my kids, it's not necessarily needed to have AI solve these personalization problems. Personalization itself, yes, super important. But do we need to use AI and machine learning to do this work all the time? Or is there a certain amount of personalization that we can design into interfaces through intelligent algorithms that we write and aren't actually relying on some kind of fancy futuristic system, but are using what we already have available to us?
Yeah, I was referring more to personalizing the AI. So you want to use AI for an AI function, but you're afraid to contribute your data anywhere near the cloud because it gets absorbed and then no one knows where it's going to show up again. I saw a hand go up, Yuta and then Ted.
Oh, I think there were 3 hands before me, but I'd love to make a comment on this. I think it's less as you said, the use of the AI to personalize, but rather to overcome the average training that is there in terms of the all of the functions that you want if you differ or are unexpected or an outlier, etc. So in order to torque the model in your direction, is there a way that we can actually prioritize the local over the average or the majority or the normative part of the model? Some way of giving privilege to or prioritizing the local as opposed to the general, without the need for all of the training and the huge data sets.
Mm-hmm. Ted, I'm gonna, Yuta's right. I just saw that I called out of order because Larry's hand was raised against a tree and I couldn't see it. So Larry, then Andreas, and then Ted is the order that people raise their hand.
Noticed that myself. Hey, everybody. There is a localized AI for speech to text, as you mentioned already. Right here in Boston, Xander glasses now do not connect to the cloud when they're creating captions in their glasses. So that's kind of low hanging fruit in some ways. But in my time within high tech, I learned quite rapidly that people do not use settings. That, well, you look at all the options you have in captioning, color, size, font, rarely touched, rarely. So this notion of personalization, customization, and to keep it private to yourself. You know, here we are in a FOI conference, and I think of FOA, fear of algorithms. We really have grown to not really want machines to decide what we should be seeing. But what happened to the good old-fashioned wizards? How about when you sign on to any of these apps, it runs you through a series of questions that you yourself can answer for your own, perhaps marginal kind of interfaces that you want that are different, without it having to go to the cloud. Keep it all local, but help someone get this customization that they want themselves, which seems a much simpler way to try to get over some of the barriers we're looking at.
Excellent. I think that a combination of that or having something that watches and makes suggestions, because a lot of people don't really, if they see a big long list of settings, they just blow by it and they don't understand it. But On the other hand, you don't want a Clippy that keeps popping up all the time and tapping on your screen and irritating you. So there's going to be an interesting balance there. Andreas?
Awesome. I just wanted to build on what Larry was talking about. I think most of us on this panel have probably been around and working since Web 1, right? So, so there's perspective there, right? And not just perspective on tech, but also how long it takes for meaningful tech to actually proliferate into the world. So like Larry's perspective around captioning, I think this is an important one. That's been around for a while, but it's now finally saying, okay, with Web 3, maybe we'll get it right this time. Let's build some of these capabilities in and just make it prolific, so it's not a compliance issue. It's actually just the way it should be done. So I think there's going to be things that, from the future of interaction or the future of an interface, there's going to be, I think, things that are more mature that you can build standards around that can be applied and really proliferated so that it moves beyond assistive tech buried in someone's settings, and it just becomes kind of the way the operating system runs. That's and thinking about how we can plant those seeds now, right, so that those become fundamental to the kernel of what we're building. I think, but then there's a mix of other things that are emerging and really nascent that are blooming like a garden. So things like BCI and all these other things that we're talking about, which are still have been involved, there's been work in BCI for decades, but we're still sort of hitting this sunrise, if you will, of neurotechnologies and other kinds of things that are emerging in the field, which are really nascent, which aren't there. It's Wild West, so there's no standards. So that was one of my observations is, there's an opportunity for standards and interoperability around some of these emerging technologies. And I would sort of emphasize interoperability standards consortiums before regulatory, because you don't want to necessarily start to lock down regulations on things that haven't really proven to be useful and usable. I wanted to quote Tom Gruber. He's the CTO and co-founder of Siri. And he often talks about humanizing technology. And I don't know how brothers and mothers got a bad rap, but like when you talk about Big Brother, like I think brothers can actually be good. But the idea of sort of that common idea that our relationship societally around data and privacy, we need to shift the conversation from Big Brother to Big Mother, right? That actually thinking about how do we provide the philosophical spirit, the sort of character and the DNA of how AI should behave and what it should and shouldn't do should be more like a good mother versus, a sort of territorial brother, right? And so thinking about a way of looking at that, I think is important. And one of the other things I heard was the role of being human is changing. So it used to be that, it's humans controlling dumb machines. And now we're, trying to figure out what it looks like when we're controlling smart machines. And so there's a bit more of a dance and thinking about sort of where that control lever moves. So when we think about, tactile IO controls or brain control interface, these kinds of things, the last 20 years of BCI has been about how do you make the sensor do all the work, because you're sort of trying to control a machine that didn't have intelligence. Well, now we're going to see neurotechnologies that are going to be controlling things that can think on their own. So maybe that sort of in that medium place of where the control is on the spectrum of who's doing what can shift, right? So that maybe the human doesn't have to do as much from a control perspective. I think someone on earlier said that we're moving from controlling to delegating, and I really liked that. And so thinking about the delegation in working with machines as opposed to dictating what the machine does. I'll sort of pass it on to the next.
Okay, next hand up is Ted.
Yeah, I've been spending a little bit of today thinking about what wasn't said today, but I will start by just talking about the AI issue that we have on the table. And this personalization thing, the early ideas were personalizing by doing it yourself. And quite frankly, without feedback, we don't always know what we want anyway. So the adaptive approach has some value in it giving us a mirror, something to understand what we've actually asked for sometimes. And I can give examples that are simple, such as we had an adaptive track point as opposed to a knowledge-based track point that was much outperformed the others. But we weren't able to deploy it because, well, it too got to be brittle. And I think really what we're going to see with this AI is that we really are seeing now persuasive technologies interacting with people in surprising ways with ChatGPT and generative AI. But we see that as unreliable. And 20 years from now, it's not going to be unreliable, because it's going to be this beautiful mother idea. It's going to be there to mother, not to put us down. And you take a look at what's going on when we're trying to use this kinds of AI to keep nasty stuff off the internet, and maybe a lot of gigantic amounts of effort are going on at some of the biggest companies in the world to try to quench the dangerous communication and false communication that's going on. It's quite nefarious at the moment. It seems very upsetting and scary. That hopefully will calm down in 20 years, and it will be more motherly in that way. And finally, this persuasive and generative AI approach and adaptive AI that will not make us have to imagine what we would like in our profile, but create it for us, is going to also bring out the expertise within people and in their interactions. And that dream excites me, because it speaks to experts and expertise being central to policy such as policing the internet, such as maybe even making a society that's more humane and less saber rattling. So that's enough about the AI side of things for now.
Okay, excellent. Utah.
Yeah, I wanted to just insert one more question, and I sort of put it in the chat earlier, but I'm not sure if it was fully addressed. And that is since we're talking about AI, one of the issues, of course, with optimization systems, the current deployed AI, not the generative LLM systems that are emerging, is the issue of statistical reasoning and people with disabilities. The fact that probably from a data perspective, people with disabilities are the outliers, and the excluded minorities not represented. It's beyond a data gap. It's beyond human bias entering algorithms. It's a statistical problem. And the question I have is, what do you think the potential is of the more generative models that use transfer and transformation learning to get over that statistical bias against someone who is different from the norm and from what it will be the optimal pattern of the past, which is being optimized now in the decision system? Is there hope that that particular bias that people with disabilities feel more than anyone else, because they tend to be at the edge of all of these other excluded groups, that the emerging models will do a better job, or that they will be less biased and stereotyped?
Yeah, and I would just like to add to that even when we talk about people who are blind or some other disability, we have the same problem, that people tend to talk about the average blind person, or at least the average blind person that they've encountered. And if you gather data about blind people and dump it in, and then you restrict it to just blind people, well, if you just dump the blind people data in, it just gets washed out by the mass numbers, of course. But even if you focused in on that, you're going to get the average blind person, if you will, whatever the heck that is. But I thought the LLMs also were all statistically based. So
well, they have statistical, yes, I mean, in the large data sets, but they're somewhat, the statistical reasoning isn't used for optimization. The transfer and transformation learning has the potential, I'm hoping, and that's my question. Is there, because of the way that it can be localized and the recontextualized, transferred to a new context, does that give us some possibility for retraining without pushing against that huge set of data?
Well, that's definitely
Yes.
a good question, but let me throw that out to the group here. Is there anybody on this on the panel that's here? Go ahead, Andreas. That wants to speak to that particular question.
Was that Yuta? Or
that was Yuta talking. Yes.
Hi, Yuta. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's actually what we're working on, is trying to figure out how to localize models that can be personalized either on edge or on device, so that it becomes highly personalized with each and every piece of additional data. The challenge is how do you not rely on reinforcement learning too much, right? So because sometimes we're right, and so you have some sort of hygiene issues and regression issues regarding the model that you might want to be able to perfect, right? So you don't go too deep down the wrong hole and it becomes unusable or completely irrelevant. It kind of depends, though, from our perspective. It's kind of like, how do you want to use the model? Like, for instance, our perspective is we're using models for trying to predict situationally relevant phrases. So moving beyond sort of next word sort of syntax and moving into entire utterances that might be appropriate semantically for a situation. So that ability to reduce caloric output, like how much effort it takes for someone to say what's on their mind in a certain situation, and generate that speech via an interface, like that's a really specific kind of personalization issue, which I'm sure someone else might have a different issue, where if you tried to say adapt the model to a motorized wheelchair, as an example, like that model might be, totally different, but it could still be based on language.
Thank you. Anybody else want to speak to Yuta's question?
So I was going to chime in.
Aaron.
This is basically what I was going to say earlier, but she beat me to it and actually asked the question and set me up perfectly. So there has been a lot of conversation about adaptive interfaces that come to meet your needs and personalize based on you. The simplest example that most people have seen is if you use a mapping software enough times, it infers where your home is and will surface that up higher in the list when you pick a destination, for example. And in the transportation space, there's been a lot of success in inferring preferences from observation. So for example, way back during, oh God, I don't even want to think about when this was, but we had a project here where there was personalized in-vehicle navigation and could learn your preferences for unguarded left-hand turns, bridges, tunnels, all these different things. And if you asked participants to set their preferences for those, they were always wrong compared to what they actually displayed when they drove. And the inferred models were always better. Likewise, you could go from a population. So for example, you could say, well, this set of people is, all older. So we can come up with a set of initial preferences based on your peer group in your demographic. And then we train from and we learn based off of that starting point as opposed to a zero starting point or the whole population starting point. So you can change the starting point at which you begin to personalize so that you have a bit of a head start based on people who are like you. So for example, if you wanted to train a speech system to understand deaf accented speech, which has a wide range in variability, but it all has very kind of, there's also kind of a general space in which that tends to be in. So you could start from the mean of that, or the mode, or whatever you want, and then personalize off of that, and you'd have a much faster learning process than if you were starting from general population, for example. And so this works really well when the inputs are easily to measure, document, and get clean signal on. So transportation is a good one, right? We know the features of the roads, we know where you're going. It gets a lot harder when you get into wide open, unstructured learning. So that's why I think you're seeing it already in products that have a much more kind of grounded, structured experience, like the mapping software that I mentioned earlier.
And the counter trained examples are, of course, an issue. How to unlearn, or how to remove the learning that is counter to what you're trying to train or adapt to.
Right. So you're changing. So the factors are essentially the value, for that factor, unguarded left-hand turns or something, starts here, but as it watches you, it lowers that, it lowers that cost, or it increases that cost. So it goes in either direction. It's not just up or down. It's not just up.
It runs to the eye doctor, where they sit down and they have the machine get close, and then they do the little flip flop to fine tune and see what you really prefer. Okay, Clayton, you're next. You're muted.
Yeah, so taking off from the really interesting Big Mother, Big Brother suggestion, I think we need to revisit Phil Agree's capture critique in his great paper, Surveillance and Capture as Models of Privacy. So in that paper, Agree identified a virtually universal problem with conventional automation, which is that those systems impose what he called a grammar of action on what people can actually do, so that the activities of people could be brought within scope for the model that the conventional automation was able to deal with. As we move to this new class of system, the grammar of action is going to become implicit and mushy. And I think as a community, we really need to understand the implications of that. There could be some good ones. Such systems may be less confining and less distorting of human action, but that may not be how it works out. So I wanted to sort of put that somewhere on the agenda. Second thing is to highlight something I think is in common with many of the technical development people have talked about, but just to surface it explicitly. That's what I understand to be the still not met challenge of incremental training and catastrophic forgetting. So many of the things we want these systems to do involve, in one way or another, adding new information to what they quote know unquote. And as I understand it now, this is an unsolved problem. So this has to be something that goes on the research agenda. Finally, and at a lower level, I think it's just a question for the people who talked about the brain stuff. We heard a lot about what we could call the sort of electrical aspect of what's happening in the brain. But as I understand it, especially with regard to things like mood, there's a huge chemistry thing going on. And what can we say about the technology available for intervening in that, or monitoring what's happening with it, dealing with the time scale of it, and other things like that?
Yeah, somebody a number of years ago, I was reading some research that talked about the fact that we keep thinking that it's all neurons. First of all, the neurons use chemicals to operate, but beyond that, that there may be a lot of other types of signals and chemicals, as you said, flowing around that are used to convey, tune, and operate. So there might be a whole nother layer of dark matter, I would say, in space. Well, this is dark information flow in the brain that we're just not even looking at because it's not electrical. Excellent. Vint, you're next in line.
So I was just thinking a little bit about personalization, and it suddenly dawned on me that, especially for the situation where persons with disabilities are trying to get the system to adapt to their needs, and if you wanted to generalize that as you have, where you have a descriptor that says these are the settings that I need in order for an application to be accessible to me, it occurs to me that there might be a privacy problem now, because if we have to propagate the information about what you need to a variety of destinations, some people might say, well, I didn't want to have, the world know that I need, amplification, or that I need bigger font, or that I need something else. So I don't know what to do about that. It just dawned on me that for some people, that information might be considered personal, and yet we still have to provide it in order for the system to respond, unless you can do it all locally with standardized interfaces to the service on the other side, and then do transformations as needed local to the user.
This is interesting. We solved the problem for Morphic, and for those that small set of settings, but it never occurred to me that there might be a need for some people to have a public trusted cloud-based repository, so that they can move between their devices and move their preferences in a way that's guaranteed to be private, versus having it moved by a company, and whether they do or they don't, you don't trust that they aren't data mining it. And of course, anybody does something, what's they go, if you're not paying for the service, you're not paying for the product, then you are the product. But maybe that's something that we ought to be thinking about, is some kind of a data trust. And I know you've done some stuff around trusts and stuff like that, so maybe you have some comments about that. I also wanted to have you to also talk about the story about adding disability data and it not working out like we thought it would. Christian, you're next. If somebody's voicing you, they're muted. I'm not hearing anybody voicing you. Can somebody voice Christian?
Emily, can you voice Christian?
I can. I don't have him pinned. Can you give me one moment?
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Okay, so I ended up just typing something into the chat box. It's for the panel. And hopefully somebody can read that for me, and then I will sign that.
Okay, I will read it.
To see that, and then I can follow along.
Okay, yeah, it says
I have that message there that I would like to read to you.
Okay, if you stop voicing him, he's going to sign what I'm saying, I think. Is that right, Christian? You want me to read the text? Let me just read the text that you posted so everybody can hear it and it's in the record. What Christian wrote was, in terms of localization.
From Christian saying, I prefer to sign, and then I want to have the interpreter read directly from the chat, but then I can provide this in my natural language.
Okay, Emily, can you see the chat? Go ahead and read it then.
Okay, great. So in terms of personalizing that, the localization and adaption, the idea of having the interface be able to learn what you need is tempting. And aside from what Andrea said about needing to be careful not to go down that wrong path, of course, you have to be careful that there's the issue and the abilities, because those can vary from day to day. There are also examples that are related to the mobility of cognitive function, but the specific case in point, my own voice will change quite a bit depending on whether I'm wearing my cochlear implant processors or not. So now it's like having a split personality in how I present to AI using speech recognition. And the adaptation has to be able to deal with sudden large shifts every day, even hour to hour, depending if I have my cochlears on or not, you know. So then in terms of my reception, it would be a different experience. It's hard to be able to split the two, you know. So if I have my cochlears on or not, it's two different situations. So meaning with AI, for example, that can perhaps recognize the speech, whereas, you know, it would be different for me to recognize that. So I'm trying to make that adaptation to figure out how those controls can, you know, change, and of course change rapidly as need be.
That's interesting. We've talked about having different preference profiles that you could switch between, but it would be nice if it could recognize it and automatically change between them and adapt to them. There are many people whose all sorts of abilities change from the morning until the evening, and sometimes it's not abrupt, but it's dramatic. In other words, it's gradual over the course of the day, but from the morning until the evening, voice, fatigue, motor control, all of these things. Also, people with cerebral palsy, they may have perfect control until something stresses them, like pressure to do something or something like that, and suddenly they lose control, and whatever interface would have to adapt pretty dramatically and instantly to a completely different motor situation for them. Thank you. That's very really important. And it also, Vint, it occurs to me that this is something that is not just to the disability field, that there's many other people that may find, for example, when children are around and when they're not around, they may behave differently. When they're at work and when they're at home, they're very different people. And they want all of their interpretation of how they talk and what they mean to be very different, because, you know, at work, a little bit more may mean that it's a lot of emphasis, and at home you may feel much more relaxed to show a larger dynamic. So this looks more than just sort of disability related. Andres.
Hi, thanks. And Christian, it's great to hear your voice and sharing your thoughts there. And I concur with what everyone's saying. Is maybe just to sort of put a bow on it, is that, you know, we've invested literally billions of dollars into trying to create a list of toggles and sliders in settings menus on devices, but still so very few people get the benefit of it. And so I think if we sort of take a nod at biometric authentication for security purposes to get into mobile devices, thinking about Touch ID or Face ID or these kinds of methods that require very little calibration up front, and then there's a certain amount of personalization that happens on the back end, right? So if you take delivery of a new device of some sort, what are the fewest inputs that can be asked during an onboarding period that could actually eliminate the need for anyone to go into the settings at all? You know, that you could essentially have formulas that can, you know, get it as close to comfortable as possible, so that you're just tweaking it and not having to realize that there's all these affordances that you just don't even know about, and you require a paid professional to come in and set it up for you. I mean, that's sort of silly. You should be able to have autonomy to set up your own settings and personalizations, whether that's fonts or voice or display and things like that. I think that's where things ought to go. I think the glaring thing for me, and I'm one of a few voices here on the panel that have invested a substantial part of their career working with people with disabilities. And I'd say we are grossly underrepresented in this panel of people that actually have disabilities. And then underneath that, I think we ought to have conversations with the companies and individuals who are responsible for the tools that our designers and engineers use to make sure that those tools are accessible. Because ultimately the best case is that we have people with disabilities in product management, in design, in engineering, that are using the tools to design things that actually do work, so that we can reduce our bias in that regard. So a little sandbox moment for me, but I think that it's important for us to not just think about the end points, but also what it takes to get to the end point, and making sure we have the right representation in the process. And people with disabilities aren't simply relegated as de minimis input for feedback, but they're actually co-designing or taking the wheel, so to speak, and making products. We taught one thing that's particularly interesting that I think that in the spirit of what we didn't talk about, things that I'm kind of particularly nervous about, deep fakes, so deep fakes are kind of a really big deal. And we're underestimating how powerful those are going to be in the next year. You think about where things are now in how convincing we can make deep fakes, video, audio, social graph data, entire profiles. I'm really scared of being personally deep faked, right? And you're like, so if you think about the compounding effects of being in the metaverse, of whatever that looks like, I think there's going to need to be a user experience, specifically. It needs to be a topic, I think, at an industry level around how do we address deepfakes and how do we authenticate humans, like just pure humans versus augmented humans versus entire bots, right? There's like, okay, so, if you enter a room and it's like the Matrix and you have 20 Mr. Smiths and, which one is the real one? You're the real one, but, how do you convince the world in the metaverse that you're the real one, if they're so convincing? So just something to kind of think about. That's wow, we need to think about that. Some of the stuff that I also heard today was everything we're talking about is human scale UX. So human scale meaning things that we can see and feel and touch. So things that are small as a handheld mobile device, as large as maybe a building or a skyscraper or a transit system, say in Manhattan. But that's still human scale. So, we need to have interoperability between human scale things. But then we also need to have sort of nano or micro human scale interoperability. So understanding how, if for instance, I'm getting kind of out there because that's the spirit of day one, is to go out there a little bit. Nanobots and stuff are a real thing. You can inject things that go in and are hyper targeted with precision medicine to go and deal with like localized cancer treatments and things like this that are in your gut or in your blood system. What if these things go wrong, or you want to sort of abort that process? You want to excrete whatever's in your body that's been injected into your body. Like, can you override that, or do you just have to wait for time to tell? Is there so what, thinking about this interaction, right? There's a user interface of some sort that either a patient or a doctor has to be presented with to understand what's happening and where things are going in your body, and if they're going in the right direction or not, and if you need to sort of hit the plunger. So these are, 20 to 100 year out kind of problems, but they're really happening right now. They're happening in the lab right now. So, and then also thinking about sort of nanoscale, and then thinking about multiple exponents out into space. There's been very little innovation from a UX design perspective for zero gravity, zero or minimal gravity. So accelerometers and gyroscopes. Yeah, you sort of think about how will AR glasses perform in space, right? Think about how we will interact with the spaceship, or how will we interact with other people or creatures or mammals. So there's some sort of 100 year out kind of things that we should also think about, in augmenting our abilities to operate as human beings in very different circumstances, physics wise, than we are today.
Okay. Your comment about having more people with disabilities, involved at all levels of everything. I actually have disability groups who are complaining that, and I guess it's a good sign, but that they can't get any good technical people as part of their organizations anymore, because they're all being hired by the companies. And so, and they can't, as a disability organization, compete against the company. So it's good that they're inside instead of outside, but it is an interesting side effect. Yuta, in computer vision, the idea of using computer-generated situations or people to train cars was raised. And I see you next up in line. So I just wanted to pose that back to you. It sounds like that's kind of like teaching to the test, to say, well, this is what I imagine the world looks like, and I'm going to train my cars to deal with what I imagine the world to look like. Or and until we get enough experience in the world that we run into every single odd situation. But you had some good examples of that too. I thought would be good to get on the record.
Yeah, so a story I've told quite often in talking about AI and disability is in 2014 when I tested 7 automated vehicle engines and presented them with a scenario of a friend of mine who pushes her wheelchair backwards. They all, of course, chose to proceed and run her over, thinking that she was not going to enter the intersection. They all said, these are immature models, come back when they've been trained with more data about people in wheelchairs and intersections. When I came back and we retried it, they all ran her over with greater confidence, which of course shows that it isn't a data gap issue. In fact, if you are highly unusual or unexpected, a computer doesn't know what it doesn't know, and more data isn't going to address the issue. And I think you also were suggesting that I talk a little bit about privacy, and privacy, I think, is a bit of a red herring if you have a disability, because a lot of people with disabilities have already bartered their privacy for essential services. If you're highly unusual, you're going to be re-identified, any aggregate data. And if you're the only person, say, in a neighborhood who has ordered a colostomy bag, you're going to be re-identified. So de-identification at source doesn't work. And then differential privacy removes the data that is needed to ensure that the service works for you. So I think we need to go beyond privacy and look at how do we prevent abuse and misuse? Because, of course, if you have a disability, you're most vulnerable to data abuse and misuse. So there seems to be this understanding that we've got privacy by design, or in some ways we've got these privacy protections, but they're not really working if you are highly unusual. And the same thing goes for AI ethics. The AI ethics cluster analysis to compare the performance with the majority and the specific protected group really doesn't work for you if you have a disability, because you're not part of any bounded cluster, or it's highly unlikely that you will detect the very specific outlying bias that that you're experiencing. So I think we need more nuanced, more a better approach to these things. We have been working on cooperative data trusts, so a group of people that are very unusual working together. So whether it's a rare illness, bottom up ownership of your own data, releasing it with specific permissions so that it doesn't leave you locally unless you agree, and you also benefit from the value of the data. So that's some of what we are looking at with individuals that have these privacy vulnerabilities as well.
Yuta, that's a really, I just want to underline that, because that really strikes me. You can't expect the world to accommodate your differences if you aren't going to tell the world that you're different. So that, combined with the fact that it's just futile to try to hide yourself, to go, unless you go completely off grid, you're going to be identified. There's all sorts of stories of people who suddenly get pregnancy stuff and they can't figure out why they're getting it until 2 weeks or 4 weeks later, they determine that they're pregnant, and the internet knew they were pregnant before they did, kind of thing. So I think that one of the things that we should note here is your comment about we need to figure out to focus on data abuse rather than trying to just lock it all up, because A, you're not going to be able to lock it all up, and B, if you completely make it so that no one can tell that there's anything different, then there's no way that there can be any accommodation to try to accommodate that, if you will. So that's very interesting. Ted, Aaron, Andreas, and then Vint.
Yeah, I meant to move on to non-AI topics, but I just want to comment briefly on Drew's thing, which is basically relationships are local. We have a relationship of a certain sort with a certain person, certain community, and that will have to be absorbed into the way we build our interfaces for them to function reasonably at all. So the treating one relationship with privacy and another one with openness, sharing certain things with people that need to know it, is, I think, going to be central to competence as we move forward. I wanted to just mention with the business of the deep fakes. Right now, Optivision has modules to put provenance watermarks in their cameras, and we are selling on the order of 8 billion cameras a year at the moment. So when I've talked to the people that are looking for deep fakes, the AI guys are losing, absolutely. They're running at 50% correct about deep fakes. A year ago they were doing better. And I think that what's really fascinating about the 8 billion cameras or whatever it is, it's more than people, is what they will be used for and how they will be used. The toaster will know when the toast is brown, and it will be in all sorts of things like that. And when we the other things that I think, or a couple of things that I think may not have been touched on today that I just want to go over because it's actually 4:30 where I am in the morning, is that a lot of the VR AR stuff has enjoyed talking about an Iceman for somebody's that's got a lot of pain or whatever. But Scott Greenwell, one of my PhD student at MIT, I mean, he actually, we pushed him to really test where can you use VR to outperform the competence and ability of not using it. And actually teaching physics was an example where he demonstrated it. I think I think evaluation is central to any improvement in user experience. And just another example of that is there's been a large amount of work on force feedback, people putting on outfits to go walking and people trying to retrain for reasons. But I think really in the next 20 years, we were going to be able to use force feedback in more competent ways to teach us to dance, to teach us to ski, to do all of these things that we've talked about for decades. With the high quality ML, we're in a position to understand whether we're succeeding and make these training and learning experiences be actually what we've proposed they would be. And maybe I bring it back to its context. So this relationship is part of it, is context, but everything is context. You're dancing, you're not kite surfing. These are different things, and we have to be situationally appropriate for anything to work.
Thank you. Aaron.
So I'm going to circle back to privacy. So the same research center that funded the work on the navigation personalization also funded large-scale surveys of people with and without disabilities, also older adults, asking questions about their willingness to trade. So who should get privacy? Who should get their private data? And in return, what kind of functionality might you get back? So this was questions about cars that monitor how well you're driving to give you feedback, or robots in your home to help you out. How much privacy would you give up for some of these capabilities? And by and large, this is a very large survey. The more severe the disability, the more willingness to trade privacy for capability from the system, which makes a lot of sense if you've been in the disability world for a long time. And so I do think that there's kind of an awareness that trade-off can be done, and if the capability and the functionality that you're getting back is high enough. And that's on us as developers, researchers, and so forth, to provide as much value back for the amount of privacy we're asking for. And I do want to also kind of emphasize and reinforce what Christian wrote in Discord about the difference between privacy and confidentiality. So, for example, the relay services, there's very strict confidentiality rules related to relay operators. So there is a model for, kind of creating confidentiality requirements when that level of privacy is starting to get a little too close to invasive. And I also want to point out that there's a big difference about who the information is being disclosed to. So I mentioned the survey, and one of the questions was about your driving data. And that line was very different from all the other ones: bathroom data, health data, whatnot. When asked, for your data being shared with yourself, your family members, researchers, doctors, government, so forth. Every other thing, like bathroom data or food data, was all kind of following the same pattern. But for driving, there was a huge notch where doctors were. People did not want their doctors to see their driving data. And the reason why is that doctors can pull your license.
Oh.
Right? And so you have to think about who has access to that data and what are the second order ramifications of them having access to that data, not just the first order, the second order as well.
Yeah, the other thing is that if the motor vehicle company has it and they are also part of an insurance, the problem is that some of these things, are so interconnected behind the scenes that you don't know where all the dendrites are going. And so you're giving the information to one place and suddenly it shows up in your doctor's office, or it shows up in your insurance company's office.
Right.
And it may show up in hiring. And the thing that scares me is we have more and more of this deep learning. It may show up in your employment by an engine that doesn't pick you, but the engine doesn't know why it didn't pick you. It just knows that given all of the dendrites that's coming in, that something made it decide that you are not to be hired, and so it doesn't give a reason for it. It doesn't say it's your disability. Its gestalt is to discriminate, and that's the part that scares me, is that we don't understand how these things are making their decisions. Andreas and then Vint.
Sure. I wanted to sort of point out kind of an obvious about how some of these innovations actually get out into the world. And so obviously things quite often start, right, in military, right? So military applications often start with N1 DARPA kind of level interesting experiments. And then depending on sort of where that goes, often it will migrate into clinical or into disabilities as AT or other kinds of embodiments. And then eventually it becomes kind of some bridge into mass market, right? If there's kind of a useful application. So some of the things that I'm thinking about when we think about the future of interaction, most of the interaction design that has been designed now and in the past has been one-to-one, one-to-one and asynchronous. So most of the interactions that are mediated with technology, right? It's I'm interacting with a web page, I'm interacting with an app. It's me and the app, and that's an intermediary to do something else. And usually that thing that's getting done as an outcome happens asynchronously. But if we start to look at what's happening in military now, right, we're thinking about real-time systems, right? Real-time user interfaces that require closed loop, very low latency systems. And we're starting to see sort of this expansion from moving away from just one-to-one interactions, moving into like one-to-many interactions that are real-time, as far as real-time controls, and then also many-to-one. So thinking about the one-to-many, you might have user experiences where you might have a war, a soldier that has to be a man in the middle that's interfacing with an AI in order to control drone swarms or other kinds of complex systems. So it's a one-to-many kind of thing. Well, you could imagine a world where that kind of one-to-many control interface will translate into someone who's paralyzed and being able to control multiple things simultaneously. So like a wheelchair that you can control the drivetrain and walk and talk at the same time. It's like chewing bubble gum and skipping, right? It's like the ability to do multiple things at once is quite profound. If I think about the other part of that, which is the many-to-one interface, you might say, well, you need to have smarter decision-making for a war fighter in situation, right? There could be really dramatic consequences if you make poor decisions in a battlefield. And usually they're taking information from lots of data inputs to be able to make decisions in sort of nanoseconds, right? Well, the same thing kind of applies to AT, thinking about your care circle, or, Be My Eyes is a good example where you sort of crowdsourced vision for individuals who have blind or low vision decision-making, right? And so that ability to have an intermediary that can support either a small network supporting an individual with a disability or a large network supporting an individual. Like these are interfaces that I think are going to be much more prolific, one-to-many and many-to-one over the next 20 years.
Okay. The one thing that is surprising that I don't think most people realize, and that is how much the military drives technology. And now we're going to see the resolution of our virtual and augmented reality driven again by the military, who just turned down a big contract that they had for augmented reality goggles because it was making all the soldiers sick and things like that. So, there's a lot of money to be made if you can figure out how to solve problems. So space programs, military, sometimes will do some of our research for us, sometimes scarily. Vint.
Thank you very much, everybody, for these useful. I've been taking notes like crazy. Two things have occurred to me. One is completely out of the flow of the discussion, but a friend of mine has an artificial leg, and he has been through a number of these. And one of the things that he said was that he had to make dumb the smart leg that somebody offered to him. And the reason he had to do that is because it did things he didn't predict. And you can imagine that if your leg decides to do something that you didn't predict, you can often fall over, which is exactly what happened to him. So predictability turns out to be really important. That's a crystal example of that. And I think we noticed in today's talks where prediction and predictability turned out to be important components of machine learning systems. So just a note that we should think carefully about why predictability is so important. The last point I wanted to make is derived from some of the conversation we've just been having about personalization and privacy. It turns out that probably most of you know this, but data brokers are out there not only sharing information about you, but also getting paid for it. And they're doing so without much regulation. And it occurs to me in the course of this discussion the use of data in order to make things more personalized suggests that we should be attending to the regulation of data brokers more than we seem to have done in the past.
Yeah, and I think that echoes back to some of the things that Yuta was talking about, where instead of trying to prevent anybody from having any of your data because they need it, we have to start flipping around and look at how it's being used or abused, I should say. Yeah. Right. If you're muted, Rain.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I'm thinking about this conversation in the context of Andreas's recent comment about the idea of systems being one-to-many or even many-to-one. And also thinking back to an earlier discussion that happened on one of the panels this morning, where the question was raised, is tech making us more siloed as tech becomes smarter and we become more integrated with technology? Are we becoming increasingly siloed? And related to where I'm going, also the conversations that have been happening even here on this conversation right now about privacy and how we think about privacy. What I'm sort of realizing is that we might be taking kind of a middle class and sort of workforce age perspective on these questions, because for people who are not necessarily middle class, who may have less access to money, there may actually be more of a many-to-many engagement with technology where multiple people are sharing even the same smart device. And those individuals are likely to have a very different perspective on privacy. And one example to that is a recent ethnographic study that was published looking at a high school that didn't have a lot of money and how the students were engaging with their phones and actually sharing their phones and giving each other their passwords into their phones. And then some of the uses of that technology were not, they also were not kind of one-to-many or one-to-one or many-to-one interactions. They were actually kind of, and they were not sort of siloed in technology, but they were kind of in this weird space in between interacting with the technology and interacting with each other, where you might have, say, a group of teenagers who are all standing together, having a conversation with each other, handing each other's phones to each other, looking at their TikToks, and then looking at the comments that people have left on their TikToks and talking through those comments, where you really got a completely different paradigm than what we're really talking about how people might actually be engaging with technology. And it breaks down our concepts of privacy. It pushes us to thinking more about many to many instead of a kind of a one and a many. And then it also pushes us to think more about the lack of a border necessarily between physical interactions or personal interactions and technology interactions.
That's interesting, and it raised a problem that I had also seen, where there was a woman in a particular place that whenever anybody in their neighborhood got sick, she would always search the internet to give them information. And the internet pretty soon assumed that this person had all of these maladies, and that she got blacklisted or something on something because she had all of these problems that nobody wanted to insure her. And it was just, but you're talking about them sharing each other's things. Well, if they did any interactions on that, then all of those interactions on their friend's device got attributed to being their friend. And if they're sharing passwords, then all of their behaviors are being also interpreted. So I guess if you're Netflix password sharing, then it's going to really screw up their algorithms, because they won't be able to figure out who you are.
That's why they want you to use profiles.
That's right.
Yeah.
Aaron.
So this leads into something I wanted to bring up about the many-to-one issue. And I'm going to highlight the work of my PhD student, Samantha Reig, Sam, we all call her Sam. And her whole thesis has been focused on some of these complicated situations, but mostly when you have multiple people and one AI or one robot, or your AIs are co-embodying the same entity. And you get a lot of privacy leakage between the two people. So for example, you can imagine, say for example, two people on a business trip go to the concierge and ask for a restaurant recommendation, but one of them is, clearly much more well off than the other. The concierge will very quickly kind of figure out, okay, I need to figure out like what's the right price range to do this. That's an example of mediating between two people that a human can do, but it's very difficult for an AI. The scarier situation is when two people are talking to an AI and an AI chirps up and discloses information in a way that other people get to hear or see. So those of you who remember the movie Minority Report, as Tom Cruise is walking through the gap, it's like advertising to him very loudly in front of everybody, right? And so, this could get really embarrassing, really bad, really quickly if the sort of disclosure leakage occurs from an AI between two people. An example that is on the extreme side of this is when there's health data. So say, for example, you pull out your phone in the grocery store and you're talking to it about a doctor's appointment coming up. If you are at home, it can be as verbose as needed. But if you're in the grocery store, you'd like it to be coded a little bit and to conceal some of that information around everybody. And so this notion of bystanders, second order people, this is going to become very important because, as you know, in the disability space, quite often there'll be things that we do at home that are different outside of the out in public. So, for example, you may use coded language, or you may use shorthand to convey a piece of information that you don't want other people to pick up on. And so this many-to-one, it's not just one person controlling many systems, it's also one system interacting with multiple people and having to be careful about who's hearing what and when.
We're getting close to the end, so we're going to make all comments short. Everybody, if you haven't, go to the Detroit airport, see the display where they have a display where 100 people can stand, and each one of them sees the different things on the board pertaining only to them and their flight. With brain interface, maybe we can have it even more private, where everything is completely private. But then that means how do you censor what your children see if there's absolutely no way for you to tell what it is coming in and out of their brains? Vint.
Well, I see. You're seeing me frozen in what I'm seeing. Yeah, I'm just seeing no video at all, even though my camera is on.
Yeah, no, you're just frozen. We have to have a snapshot of you.
Yeah, wow, this is weird. Okay, I just wanted to suggest that tomorrow we might get into this question of how we design and build collaborative tools that will be accessible to a broad range of people with different accommodation requirements. I'm thinking about Google Docs, for example, which have turned out to be enormously convenient for doing collaborative work where multiple parties are editing the document at the same time. I have no idea how that would look if you were trying to accommodate a variety of different disabilities and still allow everyone to interact with each other in a smooth and efficient way. So just a thought for tomorrow's discussion.
Yeah, and we need to capture these in the research and development and this is an R&D agenda. It's not just research; it's also development. What do we need to research? What do we need to develop? Andreas, looks like you're going to have the last word here.
Wonderful. Well, I'm just going to rattle off a few things just to have them on the record. But I think just as a call to say, hey, here's a survey of additional things that we should be mindful of from a interface perspective, right? Just about every wearable, every orifice on our body will probably have some interface. So we'll just sort of leave it at that. So earbuds, will be used not just for listening to music, but will be used for some level of interaction or control. There's oral apparatuses that are being designed, like retainers or other kinds of things that people can use for tongue gestures and breathing and other kinds of things. Thinking about smart textiles. So this is very fascinating. I think Google and Alphabet have been doing stuff with Project Jacquard, which is several years old now, but using smart yarns and textiles in clothing, as a two-dimensional interface for interacting with things, as a touch-sensitive fabrics and things like this that can also pick up heat and temperature and moisture and other kinds of things and make decisions on as a great sensor. Lots of radical miniaturization. Some of you might know Mojo Vision or have seen that, where you're getting into contact lens size AR optics that are projecting lasers or light into the retina directly. So you have literally nothing visible as far as physical wearables. So lots of radical miniaturization starting to happen. This is here and now. This isn't some future, right? So we're in the R&D and the development and commercialization of all these types of technologies. And one of the last ones I want to point out is this, that we didn't really talk much about. I think there was somebody talking earlier about molecular chemistry based stuff, but several of our partners are in the therapeutics, biopharma, therapeutics, psychedelics. So this combination of, if you're using medicine or other kinds of therapeutics or psychedelics, as an example, either as a therapy or for recreational use when you're using technology, it's absolutely going to have an impact in that person's experience and how they're interfacing with whatever it is they're interacting with. So I think we should obviously look at this combination, which is emerging between psychedelics or other kinds of ingestibles combined with digital device, say medical device plus therapeutic ingestion. These are combinations that you're seeing a lot more biopharma companies investing in medical devices because they see the benefit of having actual physical or electrical medicine. BCI can be a medicine. Games are now medicine. First prescribed FDA cleared games, for behavior and so on. So we're going to start to see more of this convergence between where user experiences can probably replace chemical therapeutics, and the hybrid of the two coming together is really important to pay attention to.
I want to drill down on one thing that I don't think I understood. We got electrical, of course, we got pharmacological, we got what I'm going to call activity. And of course, we've always had therapy where we've had physical therapy, but now you're talking about mental therapy. For example,
Yes.
Games. Playing a game, you're not electrically or pharmacologically affecting the person, but by playing the game, you are, it is a mental therapy in the same way you might have physical therapy.
Yes.
But then you said something about, did I hear you say psychedelics, or did I?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you didn't miss that.
So explain that one. I missed the that's pharmacological maybe, but
it's pharmacological. A lot of these are specifically dealing with drug resistant depression, PTSD, these kinds of ADHD focus, trauma, and so on. And so you have essentially like ketamine labs and other kinds of psychedelic labs that are popping up all over the North America and other countries. And these are like outpatient. You just go in and it's a clinic. You just go get treated. And
I'm sorry, you're treated for psychedelics?
You're treated
Psychedelics.
for an ailment using psychedelics. However, a lot of these psychedelics companies are also looking at combining AR and VR or other kinds of interactions with the therapeutic drug treatment, the psychedelic treatment, right? To say, can you actually enhance the potency of the outcome of the actual psychedelic treatment through using a sort of a external stimulation, right? Thinking about visuals, light, sound, haptics, content, experiences. These are starting to happen more often now. And then there's other companies that are working on, there's companies that are working on minimally invasive or non-invasive stimulation technologies, like using magnetic technologies and other kinds of technologies for driving sort of brain stimulation, for reprogramming essentially parts of the brain.
Okay, well, let me see if I can sort of bring this around as we to conclude here, and that is that we've often had drugs and physical therapy used together to try to treat, pain or other ailments, and so now we're talking about using adding to pharmacological and physical and electrical. You're adding psychedelic, and you're adding activity like playing games or something as being all interventions that may be used individually or together to try to address things. And so one of the questions is, I had not ever really thought of that dimension or spectrum. And then the question is, we actually are now creating standards for exam tables, therapy machines, all sorts of things, because people in wheelchairs can't do them, and people with different types of disabilities. And so this opens up an entire area that I had anywhere in my, on my map, and that is that if we have this spectrum of things being used and proven to be effective for therapy, are they all accessible? And how do different disabilities deal with it? If the game you want to use, you have to have quick motion, you can't have cerebral palsy. If you have to have vision, you can't be blind. And so you come into the doctor's office and he says, I know how to treat this, but not you. Because and nobody would think that, when we think of games, a lot of people say, well, that's entertainment. Well, if it's education, now it's therapy, that sort of changes the landscape in terms of things that we need to think about in terms of accessibility, that in ways I hadn't thought of before.
Yeah, and there's also those types of solutions, those combinations or individual solutions and interventions, oftentimes they're delivered in a controlled environment, but many of those things, like the essentially gaming as a therapeutic or gaming as a medical device, software as a medical device solution, those are being prescribed for home use, right? So you think about, like, you're outside of a controlled environment. So the same thing with the psychedelics, they're working on like high potency dosages for in a clinical controlled environment, but they're also looking at lower potency doses that can be self-administered, right, for maintenance between things. And so you sort of look at this where you could bring out your VR headset with a low dose version of a psychedelic and have a protocol to do some things for 6 weeks and then come back into the clinic for your high dose thing. These are things that are actually starting to happen now.
Now, this you bent my mind. We're going to have to play this last bit out to the Access Board, who's looking very much at access to medical systems by people with disabilities. And definitely it's going to have to show up on the research agenda, because I have no idea what that even all is in the basket, much less what the implications for all the different disabilities are, much less how would go about accommodating. So there's like 3 layers here. And if these in fact are turning out to be really effective therapies, and again, just think of one population, and that is veterans who come back, who have multiple industries, multiple disabilities, PTSD, and they find something that really works for them, but it's not going to work for any of them that are really wounded. that are physically wounded, I should say, in addition to being psychologically, because PTSD is an absolute wound.
It's a hidden disorder. Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's probably a worse wound than some others because you can't see it, so people just don't count it, if you will. Like many people who have hidden disabilities, they don't count if you can't see it. Okay, excellent. We'll bring this to the close on this one. I think we're going to do a summary tomorrow morning of the outcomes, because it's going to take us a little bit of time to digest all this, but it's going to be short because we have another big day with a lot of panels that are all 1 hour long, and they need to be 1 day long each. But again, everybody remember that the purpose of this whole thing is to be able to generate the research agenda. So we don't have to solve them in our meetings tomorrow. What we need to be able to do is to raise them like we just did now and capture them so that we can then carry on. And we are going to have Discord channels going so we can have continuing discussions on them, but we want to be sure that we capture them all and get them onto the research agenda. When I hear people say, well, you know, there's not that much research. I mean, like there's a lot of money on research and things, but disability is just this one little area, and there's nothing more diverse than the research in the disability area. And so we want to be able to capture and be able to give them a very rich, diverse agenda so they can see the full spectrum of what they need to be looking at going forward. And again, this is not just funding agencies, it's professors and students. Students and professors is a really powerful one. I'm always hearing professors say, oh, it's fantastic to have a project that is where our expertise is needed to advance something, and it's going to help somebody rather than just the military or you know, a gaming company or something like that. They really do look for that. And so that's another big thing. And of course, we have all the companies who are investing in this too. All right. Well, thank you very much. I think we're going to wrap up at this point and let everybody go, let the people off. And I did want to just do a shout out again to all the people who have been making this thing work. And so if all the people in the background, there they are in the back, you got to take your blur off because all we can see is is you in the front, Crystal, or there you go. In the side there, you can see all the people that have been making all of this happen today and keeping it up. And it was an amazing amount of work to pull this all together. So I wanted to give them a shout out today. We'll give them a shout out again at the end of tomorrow as well. So thank you, everybody. And we'll see you on the morrow.